So tonight we're very happy to have Cheryl Platz with us, speaking from Seattle, Washington, on the Carousel of Progress, adapting to a post-pandemic world. So someday we will get to the post-pandemic world. And actually right now we're post-pandemic phase and, into a new phase, but I'm really interested to hear what she has to share with us tonight about, how we adapt to this. She just launched a book. What is it? Is it Design Beyond Devices, Creating Multimodal Cross-Device Experiences? And she will tell you more about that. She has a really broad experience working with Amazon, Microsoft, Electronic Arts, Kryptonite, games, Disney parks, at Maya Design. And she is the principal and owner of her own design education firm, Idea Platz, LLC. So with that, I'm going to stop sharing and I'm going to let Cheryl take over. And thank you for joining us, Cheryl.
Thank you for having me for the introduction. Well, hello, everybody. CHIFOO, thank you for having me. It was a little bit more optimistic than I thought when I was pitching it, that we would be post-pandemic. And, my current full-time job at the Gates Foundation, and I do not speak for them, by the way, but even we were thinking we would be a little further along by now, maybe. But the good news is we can still talk about a post-pandemic world, because at some point, all time moves forward, and it just means we'll have more time to apply the things we're talking about today. So we're just more prepared. I want to talk to you about how we can learn from how the world has been transformed by previous pandemics and world events, and what that means for what's already happened and what's coming around the corner. So let's get into it. So the Carousel of Progress keeps us turning. I am a Disney nerd, so if you've been to Disney World, you know what this is. Well, if you've been to Disney World and you do the e-ticket ride, or the A-ticket rides, like the ones that nobody rides. The Carousel of Progress is a very historical ride. It was at the World's Fair, but it's a big ride in a round theater that has little sections. Basically, the audience rotates around the theater, and each section depicts an era of modern life, and from like the 20s to the 40s to now, and the big sort of technological advance in itself that the theater moved instead of folks. I can say from a personal experience that when it breaks down with no sound, but the animatronics keep moving, that's pretty creepy in and of itself. But when you just keep turning and there's no sound, but that's another story for another time. But the Carousel of Progress, the metaphorical Carousel of Progress that Disney talked about, keeps us turning, keeps the world turning. And it launches new technologies into adoption at speed, in particular when we board it, because a new event has driven us to go around the carousel again. And it also spins ideas we've seen before into wider use. So vaccines arrived because of the polio endemic. NFT, which we'll talk about later, or near field technologies and tap to pay, was a technology that had been around for a long time, but really came into frequent use because of our pandemic. So the Carousel of Progress, this constant it seems like, if you go and sit in Disney's ride in Disney World, it seems like this constant force, this comforting sort of drumbeat. But when you actually look at how technology moves forward and what's causing technology to move forward, it is often these inciting events like what we're going through right now that cause us to sort of leap forward significantly. Even when those technologies have been around for a long time, it's the inciting event that causes us to really move forward and adopt these things. When it spins, change settles in fast, and we get launched into the future. So I'm not going to say that the scenes from that ride aren't creepy when taken out of context. It's both historic and nostalgic, and also, when he's just standing still, you're like, okay, well, there's a little bit of an uncanny valley situation going on. I'm willing to acknowledge that if you're not a fan of the ride. But in this scene, they're going on about the marvel of wires and how could anybody have lived life without electricity before? But at some point, just a few years prior, they would have had no wires in their house, and some inciting events caused them to sort of bridge that gap. But what's the price of admission on this ride? You can't just walk on the Carousel of Progress. You got to have a ticket. You don't just simply walk on. We can't just decide that history is going to move forward. There's usually something that causes people to accept new things. There's some force, because objects at rest like to stay at rest. People, we've all changed a user interface and had feedback that people did not like it because what they liked was the comfort of the previous interface. And so unfortunately, it's often wars or politics or disasters that start turning the carousel. And sometimes positive change comes out of these rides. Sometimes it's not as positive change. And pandemics are another one of those things that buys us a ticket onto the Carousel of Progress. We are riding that carousel right now, and it turns out it's like an extended bonus, super long party ride. I once rode a ride on the New Jersey shore on the boardwalk, and it was a tilt-a-whirl, and there was no one else on it, and so the ride operator was just like, "You guys keep going," and I thought we were gonna die on that ride. And it kind of feels like that right now. It feels like the operator on the tilt-a-whirl has just like kind of pieced out and taken a break. Like, no, we're good now. It's fine. But we're still on the carousel. Coronavirus has distracted the operator of the ride. But before we go into the coping strategies, I think it is important and instructive to take a look back at some of the past pandemic-inspired turns of the carousel. In particular, the Black Death, the polio endemic, and the Spanish flu, because there's some really interesting things that we take for granted that came from each of these pandemics, and by looking at them, we can kind of start to sort of draw some patterns out. Like, what sorts of things would people be comfortable with as a result of pandemic-related change, or what sorts of things, how does society adapt? So the Black Death. We've all heard of it in hushed tones in elementary school or middle school when we started learning about history. And quarantine came out of the Black Death. Quarantine started in the city of Ragusa, it's a Croatian city, where they forced ships to anchor offshore for 30 days for the purpose of disinfection. Very ahead of their time. Well done, Ragusa. And it's funny because the original quarantine period was 30 days, but the word comes from the Italian word for quaranta, which is 40 days, which has a whole biblical implication, which we're not going to get into right now. There was also, around the same time, they started setting up plague hospitals that were set up to deal with the sailors coming in who were infected, or anybody who happened to get past the quarantine. Prior to but no one did this. There was no need to do this. There was no need to really control your ports. There was no need to ask yourself what might be someone bringing across our borders. But after it, this attention to detail, this attention to this transition from you're coming from outside, now you're crossing our borders, and this period of time, this holding period, that all came out of the Black Death. But also, I think, really instructive given the tension we see right now with workforces and hiring, especially at like more sort of subsistence levels, is the decline of serfdom that came out of the Black Death. There was a drastic reduction in the available labor force, and in Western Europe, that changed the nature of supply and demand. There just wasn't enough labor to go around and support the previous system. So the workers that were left were able to negotiate for better terms like lower rent. And in addition, you also started to see technology and process improvements because the people who were left still needed to do more work. So they needed to adopt sort of higher productivity means of doing that work. Now, the landowners did not love this. And they, after a while, they kind of got together and were like, you know what? I'm over this whole, surf up thing. We need to get things back to where they were. They tried to restore the previous order, and they just ruined everything. They just spurred a ton of major peasants' revolts, and the changes really took further hold as a result of those landowners trying to return things to the way they were. And I think that's a really interesting thing to look at when we look at what's unfolding right now, and people trying to tell folks who have been living with unemployment for the last year that they're the lazy ones and that the problem is them. That didn't, it's things trying to enforce the old world order did not work out well in the Black Death. Just saying. Now, moving forward to the polio endemic, and the words pandemic and endemic are interesting, right? Like pandemic is sort of a disease that we believe we can, I'm no epidemiologist, but in general, a pandemic is a disease we believe we can stop or stop the outbreak of, whereas an endemic is kind of an ongoing disease situation. It is entirely likely at some point that COVID-19 may cross the border from pandemic to endemic. Polio is an endemic now. It's there, and it can still hurt people in the regions where it exists. And so there's a polio endemic in Pakistan and in Afghanistan, which we at the Gates Foundation are continuing to try to fight. But as a result of the polio endemic, eventually we gained vaccine technology. It was interesting because they had a rough start. Like, vaccines have always had a rough go, despite the fact that they save so many lives. People have always been there have always been false starts and folks being skeptical. And, understandably, people putting things into their body, that's nerve-wracking. But interestingly, the availability of multiple options helped diffuse tensions, not entirely like what went on when we got Moderna and Pfizer and Johnson & Johnson coming out. So there were multiple delivery techniques that came out all around the same time. When there was this during the era where the vaccines finally took hold in the 50s and 60s. There was the oral route and the injection route, so two very different delivery techniques. And there were two different sort of philosophies for dealing with the virus. There was a live polio vaccine, and there was an inactivated polio vaccine. So the inactivated polio vaccine, kind of like break the vaccine up into bits and hope that the immune system will deal with it, versus the live one, you're just hoping it's just a small amount will be enough to get the immune response. The live attenuated vaccines were the first released. A lot of our parents have memories of that being dropped on sugar cubes. And then the Salk created the first successful inactivated one that was delivered by injections. And there were, I'm not going to go into the history terribly much, but one of these had, there was an incident where there was a contamination situation in one of the batches. Again, sounds familiar. And unfortunately, there were some lives lost. And that really, really sort of shook people's faith in the concept of vaccines. And if there hadn't been multiple options at the time, I wonder what would have happened to the whole concept of vaccines. But mercifully, there were options. Looking forward even further to, well, I kind of done it a little out of order here, but for the Spanish flu, let's take a step back to 1918 and talk about technology, because some of the technology we treat as common today actually began as pandemic-inspired adaptations. This one fascinated me. I heard it recently. Radiators. Stale air was viewed as a health hazard. And, we also, ventilation's pretty important right now, but it was viewed as like, it wasn't so much that there was pathogens, so much as the existence of the stale air could make you sick. And so there was, especially in New York, there was an order that windows should be open at all times for ventilation, even in winter. And this was when we were building New York City up. 75% of the square footage in New York was built during the Spanish flu. And so the radiators that are built into most of the homes, or like the apartment buildings in New York City, were designed to pump out heat at levels to overcome the cold temperatures coming in from open windows on the coldest day of the year, because that's what the law said windows should do, is the windows should be open all the time. So now, decades later, people are like, oh my God, my heaters, they're so overwhelming. It's because they were designed to be. And that was how New York was built. And it's really fascinating to me that this, like, the timing of this decision and when it happened, we just accepted this, like, it was just accepted that this was the way heating and steam heating should be done, and it happened so quickly, no one questioned it. And we still live with the results of that decision in many metropolitan areas. That was just fascinating to me. And dishwashers too, machine washing technology had existed prior to the Spanish flu, but the Surgeon General reported that rates of flu transmission were reduced by as much as 2/3 by machine washing of dishes and utensils over hand washing. And so for big organizations where cross-contamination would be likely, like a hotel or a hospital or the military, suddenly these became really a lifeline to continuing to exist. And so what was really kind of a novelty technology suddenly became really critical and got commercial adoption very quickly. And so, there's a couple examples here of, just in these two technology examples, we have one where a new technology evolves in the middle of a spin around the Carousel of Progress, and it evolves so quickly that it manages to go super broad really quickly and worm its way into, like, most of New York City in just a few years. And then dishwashers were machine washing of dishes was a technology that already existed, but it was the pressure of the pandemic, the Spanish flu, that drove them sort of into the mainstream. And we'll see that theme in some of the stuff that's already happened in our pandemic as well. So when the carousel turns, the world can change so quickly, we almost forget what came before. And it can be a blessing and a curse when we look at radiators and kind of what we've had to live with forever. And I think the radiators are a really good example to keep coming back to when we look at what we as designers have to deal with, and the responsibility we have right now in this extended pandemic state. The world is still in a kind of chaotic place where change can take hold and people will not question it. And some of those changes we may be stuck with for decades. And so are the changes that are being rolled out the right changes? What are the potential consequences of rolling out those changes? So what does a turn of the carousel look like? To me, there's 3 stages of the carousel. The first stage is adapting. So an external event or events take place and an adaptation takes place. Now, this can be either we're creating a new innovation or we're taking something that already exists and adapting it for additional use. So we're taking those machine dishwashers and applying them to commercial circumstances, or we are inventing the radiators from scratch because we need some kind of heating solution that will overcome the need to have windows open all of the time. From there, we start to get some early adoption, our traditional early adopter curves that we all know and probably love from rolling out traditional digital products. And then the really important step, and the one that takes so much more time when we're not riding the carousel, is the movement from adoption to assimilation. Like, the movement from adoption to assimilation on the radiators example was way faster than it would have been under normal circumstances. The movement from adoption to assimilation of the decline of all serfdom in Western Europe, like, they had no social media, they had no way of communicating. The fact that they were even able to accomplish such a feat in just like a decade's time is astonishing. But it's the carousel was turning, the momentum was pushing them in that direction. And so when we are in these times of chaos and people are looking to fill the gap, it is easier for the society as a whole to take bigger leaps, to adapt, to take the same leap that the early adopters were and bring it into our culture. So, what questions do we encounter at each state? At the adapting state, it's like, what new needs have arisen? Are there existing or underutilized technologies that address this need? And if not, how might we address this need quickly? So if you are trying to take advantage of the Carousel of Progress and you identify a need that still exists as a result of or adjacent to the pandemic, these are the first questions you're going to want to ask yourself, particularly around existing and underutilized technologies. There are a lot of examples in the past and in the present of technologies that existed for years and years and years, that did not hit assimilation until the inciting event of the pandemic occurred. So just because people haven't used it yet doesn't mean that this isn't the right time for people to start using it if it's solving a real need that people have. Adoption, the question, of course, is like, how do you get the word out to these about these solutions in the middle of all the chaos? And, you know, how are we going to evolve the solution traditionally, like user experience designers want to do, based on those early adopters? I think this is kind of almost the toughest part because things move so fast that what I'm seeing is that there's almost, especially with technology that was adapted last year, there was almost no time between adaptation and assimilation. People just went from, we'll talk about Zoom in a second, but it went from 0 to like 7 million billion people using it. Not a technical count, but approximate. And so there were some scaling issues, right? We didn't have time to like do a loop and gradually scale. We just went from before to after. And so it can be a struggle to try to see if you can get any feedback from the first people who are getting on the ride. And then in the assimilation loop, it's, you know, how are ordinary people learning about this? Like, is any word of mouth needed at all? Can this experience be easily adopted by a wide variety of customers and experience levels? Because that's another problem with any sort of big push, is the question about whether we're leaving anyone behind, especially if there's not enough time to be careful about usability testing or watching, kind of, you know, being methodical about rolling these things out, especially the things that have taken off in the last year. Many of them have not had the chance to be methodical. And so there's a question like, are we leaving anyone behind? Is there bias in the rollouts? Is there bias in the technology? Are there unintended consequences? And so understanding kind of these phases for how the carousel spins around can help you be a little bit more intentional about figuring out where you and your technology may be and what steps you might be missing. But what about our carousel ride? We are still on it, and COVID won't let us go. So how do we, like, what does this specifically mean for us? Let's take a look at what's already happened in the past year and how it kind of maps to the mechanics we've already talked about. The Carousel of Progress has already spun many major changes into the fabric of society that will probably seem ordinary in just a few months or years, and some of those changes already seem normal, like the way we're meeting right now. So digital meetings have gone mainstream, and they will never, at this point, they will never not be mainstream, unless something comes in to replace them. Maybe we're just all telekinetically communicating with each other and don't need video at all. But for the time being, they've really arrived. And what's interesting when we talk about the Carousel of Progress is this technology existed for a very long time before the pandemic. Zoom came out in 2013, Skype for Business in 2015, and Microsoft Teams in 2017. And the pandemic hit in 2020. And I remember, you know, I was at Microsoft when Teams rolled out, and it felt like a novelty. Even at Microsoft, we were like, really though? Like this feels like a lot. Can't we just meet in person? Like even working at the company that was releasing these tools, we didn't quite get it. Even when we were encouraged to, as a condition of employment. It took this spin around the carousel for us to see this technology, a lot like the machine dishwashers. Say like, oh, that's what you meant. Oh, yeah, we can use it like that. That makes sense. And, you know, when it comes to teleconferencing, it kind of makes sense that we needed critical mass and we hadn't got critical mass in those early years. In a way, some technologies kind of do need that instantaneous flash where everybody is suddenly on the other side of the line. And we're all familiar with these hockey stick graphs. We've seen them. Zoom's revenue growth just went leapt up. People still won't stop talking about it. Although interestingly, it has leveled off significantly. It was not a good week for Zoom. And Teams, their active daily users, also hockey sticked up. That's, you know, the conversations that you're going to hear about Zoom this week, where they're like, well, it didn't really live up to expectations. Well, we moved the bar and the goalposts on Zoom. Those expectations are in a world where people meet online and everyone's expecting Zoom to be pulling in a ton of money all the time. Not that they're comparing it to what Zoom made in the fourth quarter of 2019. Those days are gone. But somehow, and this, most of the change happened in 2 months. We went from 7 years of people being kind of lukewarm on video conferencing to 2 months in which the whole world just sort of transformed. And it wasn't just, okay, I understand the need for video conferencing now. It went even deeper, which we'll talk about in a minute. But another big transformation that occurred in the last year was the contactless payment. I don't know if you've noticed this, but I got my little Apple Watch and I'm running around and don't like carrying around a wallet. But there were still a lot of local businesses for a long time that didn't take contactless payment. It required an upgrade to their equipment. They didn't have it. And I had credit cards that did not support contactless payment, and they would send me new cards and that did not support contactless payment, which was fine. But it existed, but it was not mainstream. But and again, that technology had been around even longer than Zoom. The first examples of near field tap to pay were in 2005, and then Apple Pay and Google Pay showed up shortly after Zoom did in 2014 and 2015. But it seems like stores and banks were elected to invest in the technology without demand. It's a hardware upgrade, and understandably, the tech industry, sometimes we change standards. I can see how they might have thought we could change it on them and they just have to get new hardware again. So, okay. But again, last year happened and suddenly no one wanted to touch anything. And pretty much every business in my local vicinity upgraded all of their touch to pay devices with great expediency. So something that they had been resistant to do for years, again, happened in just the span of a couple months for any companies that could get the hardware. So tap to pay transactions are up 30% year over year. And what's even more interesting is 47% of people will just straight up not shop without contactless payment now, which is not true of people at the beginning of 2020. That's a fundamental shift. And that explains why companies are willing to go out and invest in the hardware now. But it wasn't just, hey, we're cool with what we understand the need for remote calling. The transformation on the carousel, as we know, also encompassed the shift to working remotely, not just taking a call or two remotely, but moving the center of one's work gravity to home. And again, this concept existed before the pandemic. GitLab was founded as remote only in 2014. WordPress sold its headquarters to go remote only in 2017. The concept, certainly people, individuals, consultants worked from home for a long time, but the concept of an entire company going remote only or hybrid was not new to the pandemic. It was pioneering, but it certainly was not new, but it was not mainstream. When it happened, people would be like, that is weird. That is weird that those people do that. That's not for us. How could someone live like that? And then people would just move on. But the remote work assimilation was almost instantaneous. Went from that many years of people just kind of saying, that's an interesting experiment that someone over there is running, to by mid-2020, 96% of people surveyed wanted some form of post-pandemic remote work.
My name is Jonathan. I'm a roadside assistance driver.
Yes, hi.
We need to get that
Need help with a
muted.
jump start on your vehicle?
Yes, I do.
So I'm just gonna go ahead and
Let
mute that
I'm
person.
about 27 minutes away.
Okay, no problem.
There we go. Great. So 96% of folks wanted to work remotely by midsummer, and this was not something that existed beforehand. That was not the state of affairs before midsummer. 65% of the people who said that they wanted to work remotely wanted full-time remote work. That is a huge change in just a couple months. And even crazier, 33% of people in April 2021 reported that they will quit their jobs if they can't work remotely at least part-time. So this huge change in the way we look at our work happened nearly overnight and is basically permanent. Unfortunately, employers are having a harder time sort of joining their employees on that side. And so that tension is something that I don't know if designers are going to have to help folks with, or HR, somebody's going to need to reckon with this big gap. Like the middle of last summer, 80% of leaders were like, yeah, we'll allow at least part-time remote, but and 47% said they'd allow full-time remote, but midsummer this year, only 10% of jobs on one platform were remote. And we saw the highest level ever of people quitting their jobs recently in April, 2.7%, according to the government statistics. So the change was instantaneous in employees, but the industry has not caught up. The carousel spun very fast, and some people are dizzy. So we can see examples from our recent past of the way that the pandemic events or these big, large events just kind of blindside us and shift the ground underneath us overnight. The way that we can see technologies for years and our relationship with them is changed because of these major events. What does that tell us? Like how can, and what additional shifts may be coming? Because the longer this goes on, this carousel is going to keep spinning. Like we're going to keep getting burnt out. There's going to be, God forbid, I hope Delta's the last wave, but y'all know we're heading into another school semester. It's going to be, we're heading into winter. It's going to be rough. So let's use some imagination. And none of us have really headed back into the office fully. And that's a whole new can of worms. So let's use some design imagination to see where our design skills may be needed next on the carousel. So one, and this one's kind of close to my heart because one of my jobs at the Gates Foundation is sort of ethnographic observation and service design of the in-office experience, trying to figure out how we can be more inclusive in the office, how we can figure out what's working and what isn't in the hybrid environment, and just kind of observing what's evolving. And certainly one of the big changes coming around the carousel is the fact that our hybrid workspaces are going to need hands-free, socially distanced engagement models. I saw this like firsthand because my first day back at the office was like July 28th, I think. And then 2 days later, they reinstated the mask indoor mandates. And like the company had to message everyone and say like, we need social distancing again. All the conference room capacities are cut. We're reconsidering a bunch of our hardware investments. The window of time where we could tell ourselves that the old way of interacting with the office was going to come back in any way, shape, or form lasted about 3 weeks. We went back to the office on July 7th, and then 3 weeks later, that just kind of went out the window. This thing keeps coming back. We're going to fundamentally need to change the way the office works. What I've already seen from my research on kind of other industry best practices and other trends and what we talk about as we talk about our return to office, proximity tags and the systems needed to keep employees maintaining separation, new forms of gesture systems for things like opening doors, contactless sharing in conference rooms, and what could be coming. I know we've been talking about there's a new generation of voice recognition devices for conference rooms, like a whole suite of devices for like Teams rooms, for example, that serve a number of purposes. I think this is one that is more of a prognostication on my part, but I feel like spatial audio for personal voice interactions is probably coming. Like, if you don't want shared keyboards for everybody, how can you make it so that people in larger spaces can have voice interactions without like deafening everybody or having 8,000 Alexas talking to each other? Because I worked on the Alexa team and we all had Alexas on our desk, and you don't want like 12 Alexas talking at you. Trust me, it's very disconcerting. I did not like that at all. So phones is a proxy for physical interactions, but we're going to talk about that one more a little later. And this is just the start of things, like who's going to want to touch a whiteboard marker? There's all kinds of things that are going to need to change in these environments. And I don't think we've fully scratched the surface of the depth at which people are going to be willing to accept change. The people who want physical interaction are probably going to be open to whatever it takes to make their environment safe to allow that physical interaction. And then it's up to us to figure out what is the most responsible way forward in that new world. So an example diving deeper on this technology, contact and proximity tracing, there's like 3 different models kind of evolving that if you were a service designer or if you were working at a company trying to get into the space, you would have to reckon with. As we know, many governments have experimented with smartphone-based contact tracing, now supported by mobile OSs. But that is not so much intended for like real-time stuff, like you 2 are 6 feet apart right now. And, there's some privacy concerns, but it is supported by mobile OSs. So there's that. Some workplaces like mine are giving employees physical sensors to track proximity and to alert you when you have kind of gotten too close to each other. But there are issues there, like then you have to funnel all employees through specific doors so that you can give and take back the sensors, and there's like a whole onboarding thing. And then there's tools like the one in the background here, this sensor called a point grab sensor, which is mounted, on a ceiling or a wall and can anonymously track like group density from a distance to see like whether or not there's problems in the space. It's less privacy invasive, but you might not be able to pinpoint, like communicate with the exact individuals who are having the problem in those moments. So there's already a bunch of different models people are experimenting with for how to keep people safe in shared spaces. So, this isn't Michael Scott's office anymore. All of these methods, and there may be new methods coming, who knows? But the smartphone, the wearable, and the mounted sensor all come with pros and cons. The smartphones really can be privacy invasive, but it doesn't require any additional investment. But it's not really like time granular necessarily. If you did make it so that it could notify in real time, like the privacy implications would be super large. The wearable works, these little smart tags, but there's like a whole check-in and check-out. We had to close a parking garage to make that work because it's like an alternate exit, and you have to train people on what to do and how to use it. And those sensors, being anonymized, can't really pinpoint the people who are too close. So how do you know? Like, how do you know what the right path forward is? This is all uncharted territory. Half of this technology did not exist 6 months ago. What the heck are we doing? And it sounds like preaching to the choir, but my immediate advice to folks is to start by seeking new clarity in the context of use. And in the second chapter of my book, Design Beyond Devices, I talk about applying an improv framework to increase the granularity and depth of your customer outreach along these dimensions, because there was a lot that we could assume was true in 2019 that is no longer true. An office works like this. A desk looks like this. A person's home is set up in this way. And many of those things are no longer true. And we kind of need to stand the sorts of questions we would ask our customers on our head. And I like to give folks we have this shorthanded improv for what makes a compelling scene that an audience will believe and want to follow, so that we as actors on stage can try to hit each of these points very quickly in a scene, since people are paying to see us. And so for each of these character, relationship, objective, and where, the 4 letters in Crow, I have a series of challenge questions. And actually I have a free interview guide on my website, on the Idea Platz website, if you're interested in this, where you can just it helps you dig into these questions. And many of these are not necessarily the types of questions we would have asked before. Some of them feel a little bit more ethnographic or observational, but the character in Crow refers to the things that define your customer as they exist in the world. So how do they define their identity? What are their attitudes about the world around them? And what key choices do they make with all of that information? The relationship part of Crow talks about how your customer interacts with not just their device, like how is it theirs? Did someone buy it? Are they emotionally attached to it? Is it an extension of their personality? And your company, obviously, like, do they like you? Are you Comcast? Like what, or are you like a company that they're really loyal to? But also to the people around them, which is something we don't often talk about a lot. I feel like 2019 user experience was a lot about a person and their device. But conferencing, how many times has another person come through a video call, or 6 dogs, or something else unexpected. So these relationships that we didn't often explore before because we thought maybe they were out of scope for the scenario are now kind of relevant. The objective, hopefully, is preaching to the choir, but we want to make sure we understand what your customer wants to achieve in the real world, not in the app, but in the real world, in the short or long term. So many apps just think about what happens when they click on the app icon and not the actual thing that the person is trying to achieve in the real world. And that those things have gotten really complicated, and have gotten, especially in a work from home world where things can get interrupted and things can get mushed around a bit. And oops, move that around a bit. Nope, wrong direction. There we go. And where is really important now, especially as we start to talk about multimodality. And multimodality is an experience between a computer and a human, where there are multiple forms of input or output, multiple modes of input or output. So could be visually dominant, could be acoustically dominant, could be physically dominant in the form of input, could be motion input in the form of like gesture, something like that. So I define in my book visual, auditory, kinetic, haptic, which is physical, and ambient, which talks about things like smell and the stuff we infer from sensors. When we deal with systems that have multiple forms of input or output, often it's what's going on around your customer which determines which of those inputs is most important to them, which will make the most sense. And so, but again, like I think a lot of the time we just sort of assumed that we knew what people's environment was, or we brought them into our lab and that was the where, and we didn't dig in. But and this is a deep rabbit hole, because sometimes you're going to ask about the where and all of your customers are going to have a very different sort of answer to this. But the good news is that's job security, right? Like there's lots of interesting things to dig into if you've got a wide variety of things. If there's one thing we've learned from the pandemic, it's that like no two home office situations are the same. Mine, for example, scares people because they think I'm going to fall down the stairs. So there's all sorts of different environments to dig into and important questions to ask. So let's assume you've gone through and asked some deeper questions about your customer context because you're dealing with some difficult questions. You're dealing with a new uncharted problem. How do you put that context to use? Do you need hands-free multimodal interactions? Like, is it enough to have people using their phones? So when we talk about multimodality, which is relevant when we start talking about things like, I'm going to use voice to replace the use of a keyboard because I don't want to sanitize keyboards in conference rooms anymore. Or I'm going to start using gesture because I don't want people touching doors anymore. Hopefully people have free hands when they're walking around and aren't gripping their laptops. Or systems that allow for multiple interactions like that at the same time, especially like conference rooms that support like video and voice and things like that at the same time. I've found that there are just 2 pieces of information about your customers' needs that can really help shine light on what interaction models are the most appropriate. Those 2 pieces of insight are how rich is the information you're working with, and what is the customer's physical relationship with the device. So the how rich of your information question is a spectrum, where on one end you've got really low information density stuff like the temperature is 72, or the Seahawks won 17 to 10, versus high density stuff like a book, or the list of all movie times for a theater, or a full video, the movie Titanic. On the other side, we have what's the customer's physical relationship with the device. And this can be either close proximity situations like my watch or my phone, which is in arm's reach right now, versus long range interactions like my Echo devices in other rooms. Your physical relationship determines the sorts of assumptions we can make about what you can and cannot do or see with or about the device. Once you have answers to those 2 questions, you can chart where your customer's scenario might plot on the spectrum of multimodality, which I introduce in chapter 7 of my book. So the spectrum of modality plots the proximity on the horizontal axis and the density of the information on the vertical axis. And we see there's 4 quadrants, basically. I'll talk about these more in a second on the next slide. But as a whole, you know, when you look at this, how would you use this particular visual aid? If you have the 2 pieces of information I mentioned in the previous slide, ask yourself, are there new experiences that could empower safer engagements for employees? The desktop they have in front of them is capable of voice interaction, is capable of haptic interaction. If it has a camera, it is probably capable of gesture interaction or something along those lines. So you've got at least 3 input modalities available to them, and multiple output modalities as well. You know, is there something that is more seamless or more low contact? Is there something that helps spread people out in a conference room that you can do? Those are questions you can ask yourself and when you're working with this particular artifact. Which interaction model might be right for you? So when we look at the chart, I'm going to come to the first quadrant last, but if we talk about voice-only devices, they live in the intangible quadrant where we have low information density. If we look back up here, so our scoped information and the long-range interactions, those are the Echoes, the Google Homes, the World, or whatever their names this week. And they are well-suited to questions. They're really excellent for search scenarios, but they're really hard to use in multi-user environments. So I'm really curious to see how the emerging voice recognition systems for like Teams rooms are going to work out. Because if there's one thing that was hard on Alexa, it was dealing with multi-user environments. So hopefully we'll get better. But direct interactions, low information density, close proximity to the customer are really good when you have a few key, often repeated tasks. But you know, the input options you have are limited, so you don't necessarily want to be creating a whole PowerPoint there. You can often shortcut the need for complex input by inferences using sensors because the device is often so close to you, especially if it's a wearable. But even with the phone, you know, light sensitivity sensors, that sort of thing. But direct devices are not well suited to text consumption or browse scenarios. Anchored experiences like your television, your living room scenario are awesome when you want to convey a lot of information. My desktop right now is also an anchored environment, and I have a lot of information density. I've got Zoom, I've got my PowerPoint screen here. And multimodality in these environments is often useful as a shortcut for search or navigation. So if I want to open an app and it's buried 6 levels deep, I could just say, open that app, have it come out. That's one of the ways we use voice on our Xbox. We're one of like the 6 people who still do that. And last but not least, the adaptive quadrant up in the top is the most inclusive and the most expensive. So the adaptive quadrant, you know, the adaptive quadrant supports rich information and it supports long-range interactions. But ideally it can support both, like it supports everything. Like those devices as they exist in the market today often also support less information just as well as if they support more information. And it's rare that those devices don't support close range interactions. So what you get is stuff like the Echo Show, where you can interact with it from afar, just like an Echo. But if you get close, you get more. You can get more of your weather. You can get additional sports scores. Now, I don't think that the Echo Show is even as adaptive as we could. The holy grail for an adaptive experience is someone can choose whatever input or output modalities make the most sense for them in the moment. Then we don't need a bunch of separate screen readers or things. Like the device just adapts to the person in the moment. And it's expensive. Not all systems maybe need to go that far, but it's something to think about. Adaptive systems are best when customer context is likely to change. Like the kitchen is a home run for adaptivity. Sometimes you are interested in browsing recipes. Sometimes your hands are covered in butter, and that is no longer an option. We're also seeing the end of shared engagement with devices and the rise of delegated device usage. Now, I'm not seeing a lot of people talking about this, so this might sound like it's coming out of left field, but I'm seeing this pop up at work as well. Who wants to use a shared kiosk, right? Like I'd seen movement to like automation where, you know, McDonald's would have terminals you'd go up to place your order, for example, or those things at the airport bathrooms where you'd press the smiley faces if you were brave enough to touch smiley faces that people might have touched coming out of a bathroom. But that all was maybe okay in a world before everyone was concerned about spreading germs in a pandemic, or being in small spaces in a pandemic. It gets a lot more complicated now. And so, like, for example, what they've done at my workplace, this just popped up magically like a week ago while I was working on this talk. The coffee machine used to be touch sensitive. You just tap on the coffee you wanted and that would work. But they don't want us doing that anymore. So they now have a touchless coffee machine. So you go and you pull your phone up and you scan a QR code, and the menu for the coffee machine turns up on your phone, live HTML page. You select your coffee and you customize it and tell it to order, and then it starts making the coffee on your selected coffee machine. I love that they have to say, and don't forget to place your cup. I'm certain that came up in testing. More than one person just does the thing and tests, and then coffee just falls down. But aside from that little transition that we need to deal with, this is really interesting to me, right? And I think that we're going to see way more of this. In a way, we already see this in restaurants with the whole well, we're not doing menus anymore. You just use your QR code. Because people don't want, whether or not fomites, germs on shared surfaces, are the primary vector for spreading COVID. People feel like they are. And that's led to the death of the menu in most places. And now we're seeing that happen on shared surfaces and workplaces too. And so what other shared experiences might get replaced by a delegated experience where now you're expected to enlist your phone instead of the interface on the screen? It's also interesting to think about what happens if someone doesn't have a phone. We make the assumption that everyone has phones. I have people in my digital communities that do not have phones, or do not have phones capable of this. So when we start talking about design ethics, there are important questions there too. But like trying to see around the corner, what other scenarios might see delegated device usage? Dining, we've already seen it in menus, but I think it's very likely that the places where, the McDonald's situation where people would go up to those sort of touch screen order monitors may move to a similar thing where you're ordering from your phone using a QR code to tell it which which restaurant you're at. Offices, I think, before the Microsoft had all these little tap on the panel to do visitor registration, I think that will probably move to scan the QR code to register for this building and sign in if it hasn't already. And this is a little bit more of a reach, but another real big shared surface is ATMs. And I wonder, could we end up in the same situation with ATMs where you're just scanning a code and telling it what your PIN number is and what money you want, and have it just spit out the money? Like, is that going too far? Are there security concerns, or is that actually something? Is it just ATM just going to be a slot in the wall that spits out money and a QR code? I have no idea, but you could see the ramp down which we could fall, for better or for worse, with delegated device usage. And you ask yourself, if you're working on an experience or a service design, or if you're a customer, how might experience providers enlist your personal devices instead of kiosk experiences? Now, when we're talking about device transitions, and that's half of the subtitle of my book is cross-device experiences. And when we're talking about multimodal experiences, both of these, I have a whole chapter about transitions, because transitions, when we train in design, we talk about, let's design for screens, let's design for voice. What we do not talk about is how we design for moving from voice to screens. It's just not a thing. And that's where stuff often falls down if we're not intentional about it. There's not necessarily an art to it. We just have to think about it and make intentional decisions about it. So for multimodal transitions, you're going to want to help ease your customers through those changes in interaction models. If you're moving from voice to touch or vice versa, how are you helping people make that change? How are you letting them know that that's happening? Did they ask to make the change, or did you force them into it? Was it voluntary or involuntary? You see this kind of thing all the time, when you ask Siri or something hey, can you run this web search for me? And then they're the results are on your screen. That's moving from voice to screen, and it's moving. The prompt is what's helping you with the transition by directing you. If she just said, here are some results, or if it's just like, okay, she just said okay, that's not a transition. That's not telling me the results are on my screen. Super passive aggressive. But at the very least, like telling me where to put my intention next helps me with the transition. And we have output transitions too. Sometimes you want me to stop looking at one thing and look at another. In the case of I haven't used the proximity sensors at my work yet, but I suspect at some point there's probably a move from like a beeping sensor to maybe looking at your phone to see what kind of alert you're getting. And on the device transition side, ask yourself, are you asking people to move an interaction from a communal device to their personal device? And if you are, is there information that might get lost in that transition? Like, how might that go wrong? And how are they going to know what to do? Like, do they know QR codes? What happens if the QR code doesn't work? Because a lot of times they don't. Are there alternatives? Are you asking people to make changes to the configuration on their phone? Like, oh, well, you're going to have to allow the camera app to work on your phone inside your web browser for this to work. Well, okay, you're going to have to walk a couple people through that. Not everybody's comfortable with that. Is there a risk to their device? If they, like, are you asking them to turn on Bluetooth or something where you should really walk them through turning that off later if they weren't comfortable with it? And how do you include people without a device? It's an ethical question. If we make the assumption that everybody has a device, we are leaving people behind, whether we like it or not. It seems, I know it can seem crazy sometimes because we all happen to be surrounded by people with phones, but it's still, and some families only have one phone. Sometimes you have one shared phone amongst everybody. And so if you're assuming that every individual has a phone, that is also potentially leaving people behind. And then anyone with a dead battery doesn't have a phone. So there's that too. When we talk about transitions, one of the best ways to bridge the transition gap is good proactive communications. You know, and sometimes it's like crafting good content, like the prompt that Siri uses to direct you to the screen. And sometimes it's alerting you like, hey, there's been a change. I need you to look at this other screen. I need you to go over here now. It's time for you to move from the phone to the watch or vice versa. But good proactivity takes effort. It's something we want to be intentional about. The picture here is a reconstruction of the original interruption matrix I built out for the Amazon Alexa platform. There is a more detailed image of this in my book. But on the left axis is these categories of interruptions like urgent notification, scheduled notification, or user requested activities like I'm picking up a call. Then on the sort of horizontal axis is what was currently going on for our customer. And there are these three categories there, like short running activity, live activity, and long running activity. And the thing there is to get to those categories, to engage responsibly, to interrupt, to help throw people between devices. There's a lot going on here. A lot depends on what your customer is actually doing when you interrupt them or when they move between devices. And you may also need a model to represent to your system what the customer is actually doing. The activity model, which is a concept I introduced for the Alexa notification platform. Now, again, I talk about this in another chapter of my book, but just as an example here, we built this out to model like what types of patterns of activity people would have so that we could predictably interrupt them. And so when someone is engaged in a live activity, we will use all critical notifications will look like this, so that we weren't in a situation where a call interruption looked different than a messaging interruption for different tasks that were analogous. So in these categories, and your categories might be different, a live activity is something real time, like a phone call, where your full attention is required. If I interrupt you, you're going to lose context. You can't get it back. It's gone. Maybe it's a live TV show. Maybe it's something really intense, like turning, you're in a car and you're on an on-ramp. But it's something where if I interrupt you, you cannot get the situation back, and your safety or your happiness may be at threat if I interrupt you. So I need to be sensitive about the way I interrupt you in those circumstances. As compared to something like sustained activity that customers engaged in, like music, where, you know, it's kind of passive, it's kind of in the background. I can probably interrupt you there, especially if the activity can be paused. The cost is really low. And, you know, there's a high chance you might be interested in the information more than the cost of interrupting that music a little bit. And we had a lot of activities, you know, that sort of fit the sustained pattern versus a discrete action like weather. You ask for weather, it's only going to take 5 seconds. It's kind of weird for me to interrupt weather right in the middle of the 5-second thing, unless something super urgent has come up, like a phone call's coming in. And in that case, well, maybe you can just ask for the weather again later. So understanding what your customer is going to be trying to do helps you come up with more responsible ways of interrupting them, more polite ways of interrupting them, and helps you be more predictable about how your system works as a whole in all of those moments of intersection and transition, moving between states. Then telemedicine was viewed as temporary, but is also an important inclusion tool for people in need. So my last point is around ethics and design ethics and tools for that. So we have telemedicine, and, you know, I live as a disabled person myself. And so, like, I benefited greatly from telemedicine. Telehealth increased by 50% in the first quarter of 2020, but there was like 154% increase in visits the 13th week of 2020, like that last week of March. There's some interesting data on like how much, like, preponderance of the people doing these visits is women. There's a lot to unpack there, but there's a whole bunch of information about how good telemedicine is, like reduced ER admissions, better access to care for rural folks, good for behavioral health, better for disabled patients, but it's not permanent. Like there were only 35 states that covered it before the pandemic. And now the other states, a lot of the temporary coverage mandates are going to run out because they were executive actions. And so as designers or people working in a policy space, it's like, how can we enact change to help make these things stick? Is cost even really the only reason to keep telemedicine if it like finds a way to include so many? And there are questions like this that we're going to encounter in our work during the pandemic. Like, how do we identify the right problems to solve and ensuring we're solving them correctly? Maybe not temporarily, maybe we're finding the right problems and solving them permanently. And so there are two frameworks I talk about. One of them I pithily call PICS or it shouldn't happen. Your kids may have at one point talked about PICS or it didn't happen, where people say something big on the internet like, I rode an elephant, and they're like, PICS or it didn't happen. So for people trying to decide if they should build it, I say PICS or it shouldn't happen. PICS stands for Problem, Inclusion, Change, and Systems. So a series of challenge questions to help you determine whether or not the thing you're thinking of doing is worth doing, or whether it might be more damaging than not doing it in the first place. So for problem, it's like, who has the need? How did you identify it? Is it just an idea? Is there a better use of the time and energy? Is it really a solution in search of a problem? For inclusion, it's like, does your team have many perspectives? When you consult experts, like doing bringing in racial experts or bringing in disability experts, are you taking action on the recommendations? For change, it's like, what might success and failure look like? And what happens if your product goes away? It's all fine and good if you disrupt folks, but if you disrupt folks and then leave them with nothing later, that is fairly unethical. And then systems, like what systems might be disrupted by your work and how can you minimize them? And how could your solutions interact with like institutional racism or other forms of systemic discrimination? A lot of the things in this world where the carousel is turning quickly, we have more power than normal to help or hinder than we do in a normal situation. So these sound like big questions, but there's also a lot of power right now. And the other tool for dealing with these things, I call optipessimism. And there's a keynote I gave about this linked in the resources at the end of the deck. But these 4 steps and a series of related challenge questions help you foresee some of the biggest problems you'll need to plan for on a sort of problem you're planning on solving. So if you've decided that a project is worth doing, these 4 steps are worth working through to help ignite your ethical imagination and help you design for the best case and plan for the worst. It's like, what are the worst conditions that your product's going to be used in, and how might this make the world worse? If Twitter had done that before it designed itself, maybe we would have had better safety systems in place. But you also want to design for the best case. Like, what would happen if like millions of people used your system overnight? Like, what would you have to do to keep the system going? Like what, that's another question I feel like Twitter didn't really ask themselves up front. And how can your project harm people, or how could people abuse your product? Another question that does not get asked up front terribly much. But also be ready to adapt in the moment. Like, what signals might you watch for that your product is not working as intended? We all remember Microsoft's chat bot that started insulting people with racist content. You know, what signals might you look for that things have jumped the rails? Knowing those up front and instrumenting them is a big step towards acknowledging that we are not psychic, but we're still responsible for the impact of our work. So there's lots more where all of that came from. So use whatever frameworks you need to evaluate the potential spins on the carousel for feasibility, impact, and execution. But we have a lot of power in this moment. And there's a lot of technologies lying around that can be used to solve new problems or exist new problems, even though they might have been around for a long time. And now might be the time that everybody jumps and adapts to them. The future is waiting at the end of the carousel. This is the last scene at the Carousel of Progress. And what's funny is, like, life finally caught up to it. Like 5 years ago, 10 years ago, this looked like ridiculous because they had like VR and like a voice activated oven. And it was just like, what are they doing? But Alexa showed up, VR, like the Oculus showed up, and now it's like, oh, well, it's not really the future, is it? It's sort of now. So, but the clothes are very 80s. So it's a mixed bag. But they did have a pretty accurate view of the future. It's a very cheesy sequence. It's cute. If you want to learn any more about these tools or concepts, I'll send a link out over email to this deck. Some of these links are free. There's a few links to my book. There's some links to workshops I'm giving. So there's a whole bunch of a melange of content. My book, Design Beyond Devices, Creating Multimodal Cross-Device Experiences, is available at most major booksellers and Rosenfeld. It's a little bit slow on Amazon right now because they've been running low on stock, but on Rosenfeld, that code right there, CHIFOO DVD 0921, 20% off till the end of the month. So feel free, and you get a free ebook if you buy the print copy at Rosenfeld, which is a much better deal than Amazon. So hang on tight, because the ride is still in motion. And let's talk questions. I saw there's some stuff in chat, so I'm going to hold this screen up there for a second and pull this open. So let's go. Scroll this all the way back up. Makes you think of crossing the chasm. Hard to accomplish, but crisis can get the early mainstream adopters across much faster than otherwise. Yeah, it takes fewer peers to demonstrate its example of successful adoption, or like it just, everybody gets scrappy and people drop their need to see other people do the thing. Mark says that it was really annoying that Home Depot failed to purchase contactless compatible terminals, even on, right? Like it was really interesting to me that there was this whole upgrade to like the chips from the mag stripe readers, and so many retailers still just opted out of the whole tap to pay thing. So they all got blindsided when the pandemic showed up. It was a little boneheaded, the folks who were just like, I am stuck in the past. So let's see. I'm glad this made you think of the long nose presentation from CHIFOO before. It took 20 years before the mouse really took off. Really interesting point, right? There's probably stuff flying around that we're not even thinking about right now that is going to leap out at us the next 6 to 12 months, especially in the office, like the office hybrid environment thing. I think especially in the multimodal space, people are going to be weird about being in the same space as others. So that's going to be interesting things are going to come out. So what will be the immune response of the systems to be disrupted? Interesting question. Interesting question. We've seen some of them, right? Some systems, there's lots of protests, and there's lots of like the counter protests. There's like not all systems are super happy about being disrupted right now. So there's that. But so are there any questions? I'm going to stop sharing now, and then we can go up to the discussion view. Are there any questions? Oh, so questions. QR codes always seem like a clunky way to get to content. Do you think some other mechanism of syncing your personal screen to the world will appear soon? Great question and great observation. Like, yeah, they are super old, and like people have never been good at using them. And several people have tried to disrupt QR codes. They're still here, but now we're using them here on the Carousel of Progress. I think Bluetooth beacons are going to be a thing. I think we're at enough penetration and comfortability with Bluetooth that we're going to see that. If you've ever been in a Microsoft Teams room, if you install a Bluetooth beacon in that room, if you have Bluetooth on your laptop and you bring it into the room, you can, and you didn't invite the room, it will like pop up like, do you want to join this room? Which is huge because the actual workflow for inviting a room when it's not invited to the call is annoying, but it just knows where you are. It's just magic. You know, there's a ton of like RFID and Bluetooth stuff that like you see used at Disney, it's there and only Disney has done it. But it could easily, it's been there for years, but easily break out. Like, are we all going to have Disney Magic Bands now? I mean, technically a lot of us kind of do. Again, like this is tough because this is a very expensive piece of hardware and not everybody will have it if we rely on it. But I think Bluetooth is a big one. I think that's there is also like just like less powered stuff like RFID scanning that on like instead of like holding the camera up, instead kind of doing a more like you go to a scanner thing and scan it and that pulls up the interaction you're looking for. So you have Bluetooth beacons for tracking attendance and delivery at work, David Dema, and yeah, it's interesting to see if they'll get deeper into workplaces. What to do about remote meetings when you aren't alone? Other people can hear or see what might be sensitive information, even if they're only hearing you. Yeah, see, the hybrid workspaces, open workplaces and remote meetings don't really combine well. And we have not solved that problem yet. Like people were just taking their calls out in the open. There's focus rooms, but there's not enough focus rooms for everybody who needs to meet. And so the spatial audio thing is interesting to me, like, but it doesn't, I think certainly we're going to see more use of like headsets and fancier headsets. Is there a way that we can like design spaces that contain sound more that don't require rooms? I don't know. So I've played an RPG called Shadowrun a couple of times, a fair bit. And they had, you know, and they talk about like bone conduction microphones and things, but there's the question of like, are there other ways of like expressing oneself vocally that don't require as much protection? I don't know. I think like the imagination has played with those things, but I don't know if they are ever going to hit the mainstream. Would we get some more sensitive microphones so that we can whisper into these things? So Google Glass had bone conduction back in 2013. So again, that's a thing that's just sitting out there. It's new technology. No one's adopted it. Bone conduction microphones just hanging out. But if in an open workplace where we don't want to hear everyone's conversation on their virtual calls, you could easily see someone picking that up and just being like, oh, that's what we've needed this whole time. And suddenly it's like the next Zoom call. So I don't own any stockety bone conduction microphone companies, but you know, that might be a thing. So that's interesting. You were shocked to see only 5 quiet spaces in an entire office for 300 employees, Kenzie. That is going to be a rough adjustment to the hybrid system. We definitely had like cage-like ones in a couple of my workplaces, and we have the glass-sided phone booths in a couple of spaces. They're of limited popularity. So there's that. Any other questions or thoughts or feedback? So I will be posting these slides to my site, and then I'll share the link with the CHIFOO board team so we can get that out to you all. And there will be the links in the back. But yeah, I hope that was an interesting journey for you. It was an interesting journey pulling that all together and being like, oh wow, the things have changed a lot in the past year, and I just think especially the workplace situation is just so interesting right now. And I kind of figured when we got here, it would be more settled than it is. And so it's actually more interesting to give the talk now because it's like, what are we going to see? Now you get to kind of like think around the corner, maybe come up with some of the solutions because they're needed. And we got till at least January for a lot of offices.
Very good. Well, thank you so much, Cheryl. That has just been, it was a fascinating talk. And I've got to say, with this last week when I was doing, research about next year's speakers for Design and Flux, I kept running across your name like, wait, we already have her. So, because that's, that's exactly what you're talking about. It's like, what are the considerations? How do you design for, situations that, are emerging? And how do we use these tools that already exist? Or plan for what are the ones that we need. So this has been really fascinating. And I just want to thank you so much for, joining us tonight and giving us all a lot to think about, I think. So with that, I think it's time for us to end. It's 8 o'clock and the timing worked out perfectly. And thanks everybody for attending. This has really been a fascinating discussion. So with that,
yeah, thank you, Cheryl. Bye.
Yeah, definitely.
Thanks, everybody. Stay safe. Good luck. May the masks and the fall be ever in your favor.
Yes. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Bye.
All right. Bye-bye.